Case 1. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. Christmas Eve 2008 began like any other holiday gathering in Covina, California. A family assembled at a home to celebrate together, share gifts, and mark the beginning of Christmas Day. The house is filled with relatives, spanning many generations, including children. Outside, neighbors decorated their homes with lights and prepared for their own celebrations. At about 11:30 p.m., a figure dressed as Santa Claus approached the front door, carrying what appeared to be a wrapped gift. The costume included the traditional red suit, white beard, and black boots. Family members inside the home had no reason to suspect danger. The arrival of someone dressed as Santa on Christmas Eve seemed festive, perhaps even expected. The Santa costume guaranteed immediate trust and access to every person inside the home. The man in the Santa suit was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. He was 45 years old, a software engineer, and the former husband of one of the women attending the party. His divorce had been finalized just 5 days earlier. He carried a 9mm semi-automatic gun and a homemade fire device disguised inside the gift wrapping. When the door opened, Pardo raised the handgun and began firing. He shot an 8-year-old girl as she ran to greet him. He continued shooting as family members scrambled for safety. Some victims were shot while trying to shield children. Others were struck while attempting to flee toward the back of the house. Pardo moved carefully through the rooms, firing at anyone he met. After emptying multiple magazines, he activated the fire device. The device used compressed air to spray fuel throughout the interior of the home. Flames spread rapidly across furniture, walls, and victims who were already wounded or dead. The fire climbed toward the ceiling and consumed the structure while people remained trapped inside. 9 people died that night, including children as young as 8 years old. Pardo removed the Santa suit, walked to his car parked down the street, and drove away. The house burned intensely for hours. Bullets stored inside the structure began exploding from the heat, forcing firefighters to delay entry. By the time crews could safely approach, the interior had been destroyed. Bodies were severely burned. The Covina Christmas Eve attack became one of the most notorious mass crimes in California history. It showed how holiday gatherings create concentrated weakness and how symbols of trust can be used as a weapon. Pardo's use of the Santa costume was not incidental, it was calculated. Pardo pursued a career in software engineering and worked for ITT Electronic Systems, a military company. His work involved computer programming and systems work. Co-workers later stated that he performed his job well and kept professional relationships. He did not show signs of violent behavior at work. He married and settled into what appeared to be a normal domestic life. However, the marriage got worse over time. Disputes arose over financial issues, personal compatibility, and long-term goals. The relationship became increasingly hostile, though no violence was reported during this period. The divorce trial would become the central trigger for Pardo's descent into violence. In 2008, Pardo and his wife entered an official divorce trial. The legal process was difficult. Financial assets were divided, and Pardo was ordered to pay large alimony. Court documents later showed that he owed tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and ongoing payments. His financial situation collapsed rapidly. Pardo's feelings got worse alongside his finances. Co-workers noticed changes in his behavior during the months leading up to Christmas. He became withdrawn and spoke less frequently during meetings. His appearance declined, and he stopped joining in workplace social activities. However, he never made threats or showed very aggressive behavior. Despite his getting worse state, the divorce was finalized on December 18, 2008, just 6 days before Christmas Eve. Pardo was legally required to continue making payments despite his worsening financial situation. He had no criminal record, and he had never been arrested. He had no history of domestic violence complaints or protection orders. Law enforcement had no legal reason to monitor or intervene in Pardo's life before the attack. As his isolation deepened, Pardo lived alone in the months following his separation. He cut ties with shared friends and avoided family members' gatherings. Neighbors rarely saw him. He did not seek emotional health help or confide in anyone about his feelings. His isolation was complete. The divorce settlement required Pardo to surrender his financial freedom while maintaining job responsibilities. He worked full-time but lived under the weight of court-ordered money. This combination of financial ruin, social being alone, and perceived injustice created the mental foundation for what would follow. Pardo had no affiliation with any criminal organization, He was not ideologically motivated. He did not act on behalf of a cause or movement. His crimes were personal, rooted in grievance and rage directed at his ex-wife's family. The finalization of the divorce on December 18, 2008 marked the point where Pardo's planning shifted from fantasy to real action. However, evidence later showed that he had been preparing for months. In the weeks following his separation, Pardo began acquiring materials for a homemade fire device. He researched compressed air systems and fuel delivery mechanisms. He bought industrial parts, including high-pressure tanks, tubing, and ignition devices. He assembled the fire device in his home, testing it multiple times to ensure functionality. Pardo also bought bullets for his 9mm handgun. He bought several extended magazines and hundreds of rounds. He practiced loading and reloading quickly. He spent time at shooting ranges, though witnesses later stated he did not behave unusually or make threatening comments. The fire device was disguised as a wrapped Christmas gift, ensuring no one would question its presence. Pardo selected Christmas Eve deliberately. He knew that his ex-wife's family held an annual gathering at her parents' home. The event brought together extended relatives, including children, creating the largest possible concentration of victims. Christmas Eve also meant that most people would be occupied with their own celebrations, reducing the likelihood of early stepping in. The Santa Claus costume served multiple purposes. First, it provided immediate mental disarmament. Family members opening the door to Santa on Christmas Eve would not perceive danger. Second, it allowed Pardo to carry the fire device openly without suspicion. Third, it added symbolic cruelty, transforming a figure associated with joy into an instrument of terror. Pardo's preparation extended beyond weapons. He planned his escape route in advance, parking his car several blocks away to avoid immediate identification. He wore the Santa suit over street clothes, allowing him to quickly discard the costume and blend into the surrounding area after the attack. Pardo's planning showed clear premeditation, not impulsive rage. There was no government pressure or institutional watching that contributed to his decision. He was not under investigation. No law enforcement agency was monitoring his activities. He faced no external threats beyond the financial consequences of his divorce. Civil court rulings had ordered him to pay alimony, but these were standard legal obligations, not unusual punishments. Pardo's grievance was personal, not political. He did not express hatred toward the legal system in general, only toward his ex-wife and her family. The escalation from financial and feeling collapse to mass crime unfolded over several months. Pardo did not act impulsively on Christmas Eve. He constructed a weapon specifically designed for the attack. He chose a costume that would maximize access and mental impact. He selected a date that guaranteed maximum victim presence. When the moment arrived, at about 11:30 p.m. on December 24, 2008, Pardo began his attack. Witnesses who survived or escaped the initial gunfire later described the sequence of events. Pardo fired multiple shots in rapid succession, targeting anyone within his line of sight. He moved through the house carefully, reloading as needed. After exhausting his bullets, Pardo activated the fire device. He sprayed fuel across the living room, dining area, and hallways. The ignition system worked as designed, and flames spread throughout the structure within minutes. Victims who had been wounded by gunfire were now trapped inside a burning building. Firefighters arrived, but could not enter the structure because bullets was exploding from the heat. Fire crews were forced to wait while bullets exploded inside the house, creating additional hazards. By the time the fire was contained, the interior had been completely destroyed. 9 bodies were eventually recovered, though identification required forensic analysis due to the severity of the burns. After fleeing the scene, Pardo drove north from Covina to Silmar, a community about 30 miles away. He went to his brother's house where he had been staying intermittently since his divorce. He did not speak to his brother or explain his actions. Instead, he went into a bedroom and locked the door. Early on Christmas morning, Pardo took his own life. His brother discovered the body hours later. Pardo left no taking his own life note addressed to authorities, though investigators later found writings expressing hatred toward his ex-wife and her family. Law enforcement seized multiple pieces of evidence from the Silmar home. These included the 9mm handgun used in the attack, the fire device, the Santa Claus costume, and many spent shell casings. Forensic teams also recovered Pardo's personal writings, which detailed his grievances and proved his identity as the attacker. Pardo's taking his own life removed any possibility of questioning or trial. Authorities proved that Pardo acted alone. He had no accomplices, no co-conspirators, and no organizational support. The attack was entirely his own design. His death closed the right-of-way investigation, though forensic work continued for weeks to identify all victims and establish a complete timeline. The right-of-way aftermath of the attack dominated local and national news. The combination of Christmas Eve timing, the Santa disguise, and the use of a fire device created widespread shock. Media outlets compared the attack to other family annihilations, and the case quickly became a reference point for discussions about domestic violence escalation. Once the fire was put out, the investigation into the Covina Christmas Eve attack began immediately after the fire was put out. Forensic teams entered the destroyed home on December 25th, working through Christmas Day to document the crime scene. The interior was unrecognizable. Structural damage from the fire made recovery efforts dangerous and slow. 9 bodies were located within the debris. Identification required dental records and DNA analysis because the burns were too severe for visual confirmation. Victims ranged in age from 8 years old to 80 years old. All had been relatives or close family friends of Pardo's ex-wife. Ballistic analysis proved that the 9mm handgun recovered from Pardo's brother's house matched the shell casings found at the crime scene. Firing pin marks and rifling patterns were consistent across all samples. The weapon had been bought legally, and Pardo had no criminal record that would have prevented ownership. The fire device was a custom-built device, constructed specifically for this attack. Investigators disassembled the fire device to understand its design. It used compressed air to propel fuel through a nozzle, creating a stream of fire. The ignition system was electrically triggered. The device had been tested multiple times, as evidenced by scorch marks found in Pardo's garage. Parts were traced to hardware and industrial supply stores, all bought legally. Fire investigators proved that accelerants had been used extensively throughout the home. Chemical residue matched the fuel type found in the fire device's tank. Burn patterns showed that the fire had been intentionally set and spread rapidly due to the volume of fuel applied. Digital evidence was minimal. Pardo did not use social media extensively and had not posted threats or manifestos online. However, investigators recovered a desktop computer from his home. Forensic examination showed internet searches related to fire device construction, weapons purchasing, and methods for circumventing security detection. Financial records proved that Pardo faced severe economic pressure following the divorce. Bank statements showed mounting debt, unpaid bills, and a rapid depletion of savings. Court records documented the alimony and legal fee obligations that contributed to his financial collapse. Witness statements came from survivors who had escaped the initial attack and neighbours who observed Pardo leaving the scene. Survivors described Pardo's careful movements and emotionless demeanour during the shooting. Neighbours proved seeing a man matching his description walking calmly away from the burning house. Pardo never confessed because he died before authorities could question him. However, writings found at his home proved his motive. He expressed rage toward his ex-wife, blamed her family for supporting the divorce, and described the legal system as corrupt. He did not express remorse or acknowledge the suffering he intended to cause. The investigation concluded that Pardo acted alone, planned the attack for months, and selected Christmas Eve to maximize victim concentration and symbolic impact. No evidence suggested that anyone else knew about his plans or provided assistance. The investigation also showed the extent of Pardo's preparation. Receipts found at his home showed purchases made over several weeks. He had bought industrial tubing from a hardware store in November. High-pressure tanks were got from a welding supply company. Ignition parts came from an electronics retailer. Each purchase was made with cash to avoid creating electronic records. Pardo had carefully assembled the parts in his garage, testing the fire device system multiple times before the attack. Neighbours near Pardo's home later reported hearing loud hissing sounds in the weeks before Christmas. They assumed Pardo was working on a home improvement project. One neighbour recalled seeing Pardo loading large wrapped packages into his car on December 23rd. The packages contained the disassembled fire device and bullets. The neighbour waved and Pardo waved back without speaking. The Santa costume itself was bought from a party supply store in mid-December. Store employees remembered the transaction because Pardo had been specific about wanting a high-quality costume with realistic details. He paid cash and left without making conversation. The costume was found partially burned in Pardo's car, along with the street clothes he had worn underneath. The 9mm handgun recovered from Silmar had been bought legally in 2007. Pardo had completed all required background checks and waiting periods. He had no criminal history that would have prevented ownership. The weapon functioned normally during forensic testing, indicating that Pardo had kept it properly. Extended magazines found at the scene held 15 rounds each, allowing Pardo to fire continuously without frequent reloading. There was no trial in the Covina Christmas Eve attack because Bruce Jeffrey Pardo took his own life hours after the attack. His death on December 25, 2008, removed the possibility of criminal legal case. However, prosecutors reviewed all evidence and issued a public statement confirming that Pardo would have faced multiple capital charges had he survived. The charges would have included 9 counts of first-degree crime, multiple counts of attempted crime for survivors, arson, and use of a destructive device. Under California law, the crimes met the criteria for special circumstances due to the use of explosives and the targeting of multiple victims during a single event. California prosecutors stated that they would have sought the death penalty. The legal classification of the case was mass crime combined with arson. The use of the fire device elevated the severity due to the planned construction of a weapon designed to cause widespread harm. The targeting of children added additional aggravating factors that would have influenced sentencing recommendations. Prosecutors emphasised that Pardo's actions showed extreme premeditation. The months-long preparation, the acquisition of specialised parts, and the strategic timing all showed kept-up intent rather than impulsive violence. These factors would have been central to the legal case's case. Pardo's writings also provided clear evidence of motive. He explicitly identified his ex-wife's family as targets and expressed satisfaction at the thought of their deaths. These statements would have been admissible in court as direct evidence of intent. Because no trial occurred, there were no defence arguments, no plea negotiations, and no courtroom statement. The case was officially closed as crime taking his own life. Law enforcement agencies issued final reports confirming Pardo's sole responsibility and the absence of any accomplices. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo received no sentence because he died before arrest. However, the Covina Christmas Eve attack generated large national attention and prompted discussions about domestic violence escalation and early warning systems. California authorities conducted internal reviews of domestic violence protocols. Although Pardo had no criminal record and no protection orders, officials questioned whether financial and feeling stressors following divorce should trigger increased monitoring. However, no concrete policy changes resulted from these reviews. Family reactions were dominated by grief and incomprehension. Surviving relatives gave public statements describing the victims as innocent people who had gathered to celebrate Christmas. They expressed confusion about how Pardo's anger could escalate to such extreme violence without any visible warning signs. Some survivors struggled with survivor's guilt, particularly those who had interacted with Pardo during the moments before he opened fire. The case became a reference point in criminology and psychology. Researchers cited it as an example of how high-functioning individuals with no earlier criminal behaviour can commit terrible violence. Pardo's employment history, education, and social stability made him an atypical profile for mass crime. Law enforcement agencies used the case in training scenarios focused on family annihilation. The FBI's Behaviour Analysis Unit included it in studies examining the intersection of financial stress, divorce, and targeted violence. The planned exploitation of Christmas Eve as a tactical advantage also became a teaching point for understanding how offenders use holidays to increase access and reduce suspicion. Media coverage emphasised the betrayal of Christmas symbolism, the use of a Santa Claus costume to gain entry, and the targeting of a family gathering during a holiday created widespread revulsion. Comparisons were drawn to other Christmas-related attacks, though the Covina attack remained unique in its combination of costume, fire device, and timing. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo is deceased. His body was cremated following autopsy, and there were no public memorial services. His brother, who discovered Pardo's body, gave limited statements to the media and declined further interviews. The home where the attack occurred was completely destroyed. The property was later cleared and a memorial marker was installed. Annual vigils are held by survivors and community members to honour the victims. These gatherings occur on December 24th, ensuring that the memory of those ended is preserved. Public memory of the case remains strong, particularly in California. The Covina Christmas Eve attack is frequently referenced in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies. It appears in discussions about domestic violence, family annihilation, and the tactical use of holidays by offenders. The case serves as a warning about how individuals with no criminal history can, however, end carefully planned violence. What this case reveals extends beyond Pardo's individual problem. It demonstrates that holidays create predictable patterns of gathering and reduced vigilance. Family celebrations concentrate potential victims in single locations. Festive symbols like Santa Claus reduce suspicion and increase access. Feeling associations with Christmas lower mental defenses. The case also highlights the limits of early detection. Pardo showed no criminal behavior before the attack. He did not make threats. He did not engage in stalking or harassment. He followed all legal requirements related to his divorce. From a law enforcement perspective, there was no basis for stepping in. However, the internal mental escalation was unmistakable in retrospect. Pardo's financial collapse, social being alone, and fixation on perceived injustice created the conditions for terrible violence. His ability to function professionally while planning mass crime illustrates how external normalcy can mask internal disintegration. The Covina attack remains one of the most brutal examples of Christmas being used as a weapon for violence. The holiday itself became a tool used to ensure maximum victim presence and to exploit trust associated with festive imagery. Pardo transformed Christmas Eve from a celebration into an attack, permanently altering how the holiday is remembered by survivors and observers. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Bruce Jeffrey Pardo destroyed his family in a single night of calculated rage, the next attacker took days to carefully eliminate his victims during the very heart of Christmas. Case 2. Ronald Gene Simmons. Between December 22nd and December 26th, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons ended 14 members of his own family at his rural home in Dover, Arkansas. The crimes occurred during the days surrounding Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Victims included his wife, children, and grandchildren. The crimes went undetected for several days because the family lived in being alone, and the Christmas holiday delayed outside contact. After completing the family crimes, Simmons left his property on December 28th. He drove to Russellville, Arkansas, where he had previously worked. He entered a printing plant and shot 2 former co-workers, ending both. He then surrendered to police without resistance. The total victim count reached 16 people. Simmons ended more family members in a single event than almost any other domestic mass attacker in modern US history. The case shocked Arkansas and the nation because the crimes occurred silently over multiple days, while relatives elsewhere assumed the family was celebrating Christmas together. The Christmas holiday provided Simmons with the being alone and delayed discovery he needed to end systematically. Simmons lived on a remote property outside Dover, a small town in Pope County. His family had limited contact with neighbors or extended relatives. This isolation was planned. Simmons controlled all aspects of his household and discouraged outside interaction. No one checked on the family during the Christmas period because such being alone was normal for them. Authorities later determined that Simmons ended family members individually or in small groups over several days. He used a .22 caliber handgun to shoot most victims. Some were strangled. After each ending, he hid the bodies on his property. He dug graves in advance and buried victims as he progressed through the household. The careful nature of the crimes distinguished this case from impulsive family violence. Simmons did not act in sudden rage. He ended a plan that required kept-up effort over multiple days. He ended family members who were confined to his property during Christmas, ensuring they could not escape or alert authorities. Simmons showed no emotion during or after the crimes. When he surrendered to police on December 28th, he calmly admitted to ending his family. He provided details about the locations of the bodies and the sequence of the crimes. He showed no remorse and did not attempt to justify his actions beyond stating that his family had become disloyal. The Arkansas Christmas crimes became a defining case in the study of family annihilation. Simmons' absolute control over his household, the extended timeline of the crimes, and the exploitation of Christmas being alone created a scenario where an entire family could be exterminated without anyone outside the property knowing. Ronald Gene Simmons was born in 1940 in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood was marked by instability and abandonment. His father left the family when Simmons was young, and his mother struggled to provide stable housing and support. Simmons later described his upbringing as chaotic, though specific details about abuse or neglect were never fully documented. As instability continued, Simmons dropped out of school during his teenage years. He worked irregular jobs and had difficulty maintaining employment. In his late teens, he enlisted in the US Navy. His military service lasted several years, but ended with a discharge under circumstances that were not publicly detailed. He did not serve in combat and held no specialized military roles. Following his military service, Simmons married and began having children. His family grew rapidly. He fathered many children over the years, and his household eventually included many generations. Simmons set up himself as the absolute authority within the family. He made all decisions, controlled finances, and dictated daily routines. Simmons alone his family from the outside world. He discouraged his children from forming friendships outside the household. He restricted their access to education and social activities. He moved the family to rural Arkansas, where neighbors were rare and outside contact was minimal. This isolation served dual purposes. It reinforced his control and hid ongoing abuse. Simmons abused his daughters over many years. This abuse was organized and kept up. He fathered children with at least one of his daughters, though these facts did not become public until after his arrest. The abuse was kept secret through intimidation and the family's extreme being alone. Simmons' control over his household was total. His wife and children were economically dependent on him. They had no independent means of support and no social networks that could provide assistance. Fear and being alone prevented them from seeking help or escaping. Law enforcement had minimal contact with Simmons before the crimes. There were no domestic violence reports filed against him. No social services agencies investigated the household. No neighbors reported suspicious activity because the family lived too far from others to be observed regularly. Simmons's rise was not about accumulating power in society, but about establishing absolute dominance within his family. Simmons's Navy discharge occurred in the early 1960s. Records from that period were limited, but fellow servicemen later described him as distant and difficult to befriend. He completed basic training and served on a support vessel that never saw combat. His duties involved maintenance and supply management. He received no commendations or disciplinary actions during his service. After his discharge, Simmons worked a series of manual labor jobs. He was used briefly as a construction worker, a warehouse loader, and a farm laborer. None of these positions lasted more than a few months. Employers later stated that Simmons had difficulty following instructions and often argued with supervisors. He quit most jobs before being fired, walking off sites without explanation. The family's move to rural Arkansas occurred in the mid-1970s. Simmons bought a remote property in Pope County using money inherited from a relative. The land included a small house and several acres of wooded terrain. Being alone was planned. Simmons wanted distance from neighbors and authorities. The nearest home was more than a mile away, making observation of the household impossible. Simmons' children were homeschooled, though the education they received was minimal. He taught basic reading and arithmetic, but discouraged intellectual development beyond practical skills. The children worked on the property, maintaining the house and land. They had no friends outside the family and rarely left the property except for needed errands. The abuse began when Simmons' daughters reached adolescence. He justified the abuse through distorted interpretations of patriarchal authority and religious texts. The abuse was organized and kept up over years. Simmons fathered at least one child with his daughter, though the full extent of the inappropriate relationships was not documented until after the crimes. Fear and being alone prevented the daughters from seeking help or disclosing the abuse. His ability to maintain this control for decades without detection illustrated failures in child protection and domestic violence monitoring. The family's rural location and planned being alone made stepping in nearly impossible. Simmons created a closed system where his authority was unchallenged and unobserved. As Christmas approached, in the months leading up to Christmas 1987, Simmons' control over his family began to erode. Some of his adult children had moved away or were attempting to establish independence. This loss of control triggered increasing paranoia and rage. Simmons believed that family members were conspiring against him. He accused them of disloyalty and ingratitude. He became fixated on the idea that his authority was being undermined. These beliefs were not based on specific events, but reflected his getting worse mental state and fear of exposure. The inappropriate abuse of his daughters created a constant threat of discovery. If any family member reported the abuse to authorities, Simmons faced criminal legal case and the total destruction of the control he had kept for decades. This fear likely contributed to his decision to eliminate the family entirely, rather than risk exposure. Simmons planned the crimes in advance. He got a .22 caliber handgun and bought bullets. He prepared his property by digging graves in remote areas of his land. These preparations occurred over weeks, indicating kept-up intent rather than impulsive action. Christmas provided the ideal conditions for the crimes. Family members were gathered at the property, work schedules were paused, outside contact was minimal. The holiday ensured that no one would check on the family for several days, giving Simmons time to complete the crimes and conceal the bodies. The crimes began on December 22nd. Simmons shot his wife first, then systematically targeted other family members as they arrived at the property or as he met them. Some victims ended while sleeping, others were shot while performing routine tasks. The crimes continued through December 26th, Christmas Day. Simmons ended each victim with cold calculation, showing no hesitation or remorse. After each ending, he moved the body to a pre-dug grave or hid it elsewhere on the property. He continued living in the house while bodies remained hidden nearby. This behaviour showed extreme feeling detachment. There was no government pressure or external threat that triggered the crimes. Simmons was not under investigation. The decision to end his family was driven entirely by his internal fears and desire to maintain control. The exploitation of Christmas was strategic, not symbolic. Simmons did not express any particular ideology about the holiday. He simply recognized that Christmas being alone would delay discovery and provide the time he needed to end systematically. 2 days after Christmas, on December 28, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons left his property and drove to Russellville, Arkansas. He went to a printing plant where he had previously worked. He entered the building carrying a handgun. Simmons shot and ended 2 former co-workers. The victims were shot at close range in what appeared to be an at-close-range attack. Simmons had no known conflicts with these individuals, and his motive for targeting them remained unclear. Some investigators later speculated that he ended them to ensure he would be arrested and face capital punishment. After the shootings, Simmons left the building and surrendered to police without resistance. He was arrested and immediately admitted to the crimes at the printing plant. During initial questioning, he spontaneously admitted to attacking his family. Simmons calmly directed authorities to his property and described the locations of the bodies. Police got a search warrant and entered Simmons' property on December 28th. They discovered bodies buried in shallow graves across the land. Some victims were found inside the house, hid in closets or under debris. The recovery process took several days because the property was large and the bodies were scattered. Forensic examination proved that 14 family members had been ended. Victims included Simmons' wife, multiple children, and several grandchildren. The ages of the victims ranged from infants to adults. All had been ended by gunshot wounds or strangulation. Evidence seized from the property included the .22 caliber handgun used in the crimes, spent shell casings, and digging tools used to prepare the graves. Investigators also found evidence of the inappropriate abuse that had occurred in the household, including documentation that proved Simmons had fathered children with his own daughter. The right-away aftermath of the discovery shocked Arkansas. The scale of the crimes and the fact that they had occurred over several days without detection horrified the public. Media coverage focused on the Christmas timing and the extreme being alone that allowed the crimes to remain undetected. The investigation into the Arkansas Christmas crimes proved that Ronald Gene Simmons acted alone. He had no accomplices and no assistance in carrying out the crimes. Forensic evidence supported his confession and set up a timeline for the crimes. Ballistic analysis matched the .22 caliber handgun found in Simmons' possession to the bullets recovered from victims. The weapon had been bought legally, and Simmons had no criminal record that would have prevented ownership. Autopsies showed that most victims died from gunshot wounds to the head or torso. Some victims showed signs of strangulation. The manner of death showed close-range death penalty rather than combat or struggle. Victims had not been given the opportunity to defend themselves or escape. The graves on Simmons' property had been dug in advance, proving premeditation. Soil analysis proved that the graves had been excavated days or weeks before the crimes. This evidence contradicted any defense argument that the crimes were impulsive. Simmons had planned the crimes and prepared the burial sites carefully. Witness statements came from surviving relatives and co-workers. Some family members who had moved away from the household described Simmons' controlling behavior and the abuse they had experienced. Co-workers at the printing plant proved that Simmons had behaved normally in the days before the final shootings, showing no outward signs of distress. Simmons never denied responsibility for the crimes. During interrogations, he provided detailed accounts of how he ended each family member. He showed no emotion while describing the crimes and expressed no remorse. He stated that his family had betrayed him and that he had been justified in eliminating them. Simmons refused to cooperate with any emotional health review that might support a mental illness defense. He insisted that he was sane and fully responsible for his actions. He rejected attempts by court-appointed attorneys to argue diminished ability or mental illness. He explicitly stated that he wanted to be convicted and sentenced to death. Financial and digital evidence played a minimal role in the investigation because the crimes occurred in 1987, before widespread digital record keeping. However, investigators proved that Simmons faced no large financial pressures that would have explained the crimes. The motive was rooted in control, fear of exposure, and paranoia, not economic desperation. The investigation concluded that Simmons ended his family to eliminate the threat of exposure for his inappropriate abuse and to reassert absolute control in the face of perceived disloyalty. The Christmas timing was exploited for being alone, not symbolic reasons. Ronald Gene Simmons was charged with 16 counts of capital crime, 14 for his family members and 2 for the co-workers he ended at the printing plant. Arkansas law permitted the death penalty for multiple crimes, making Simmons eligible for capital punishment. The trial began in 1988. Simmons was represented by court-appointed attorneys who attempted to mount a defense based on mental illness. However, Simmons actively undermined their efforts. He refused to cooperate with emotional health evaluations and publicly stated that he did not want to be spared from the death penalty. Simmons told the court that he wanted to die and saw no reason to appeal his guilty decision. The legal case presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The pre-dug graves, the organised crimes over multiple days, and Simmons's calm surrender all showed calculated intent. Prosecutors argued that Simmons had planned the crimes to eliminate his family and avoid exposure for his abuse. The defense attempted to argue that Simmons' refusal to cooperate and his desire for death penalty showed mental instability. However, Simmons' coherent explanations and careful behavior during the crimes contradicted claims of mental illness. The jury rejected the mental illness defense. Courtroom statement included surviving relatives who described the abuse and control that defined Simmons' household. These accounts painted a picture of a family terrorized by a patriarch who tolerated no dissent or independence. The statement set up the context for the crimes and showed Simmons' ability to keep up with cruelty. Simmons remained emotionless throughout the trial. He did not react to statements describing the suffering of his victims. He showed no remorse and made no statements expressing regret. His detachment reinforced the legal case's argument that he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The jury deliberated briefly and returned guilty verdicts on all 16 counts of capital crime. The evidence was so overwhelming that no serious doubt existed about Simmons' responsibility. The trial moved immediately to the sentencing phase. Ronald Gene Simmons was sentenced to death. The judge cited the extreme cruelty of the crimes, the weakness of the victims, and the complete absence of remorse as aggravating factors. Arkansas law permitted the death penalty for multiple crimes, and Simmons' case met all criteria for the most severe punishment. Simmons refused to appeal his guilty decision or sentence. He instructed his attorneys not to file appeals on his behalf. He stated publicly that he wanted the death penalty to proceed as quickly as possible. This refusal to appeal was unusual, but not unprecedented. Some convicted attackers seek the death penalty as a form of escape or as a final assertion of control. Family reactions were dominated by grief and confusion. Surviving relatives struggled to comprehend how someone could systematically crime his own family over multiple days. Some expressed relief that Simmons would be ended, while others questioned whether the death penalty would provide any meaningful justice. The case generated large media attention, particularly because it occurred during Christmas. The juxtaposition of holiday celebrations with the slow, careful extermination of an entire family created a narrative that resonated nationally. Comparisons were drawn to other family annihilation cases, though Simmons' victim count and the extended timeline made his crimes uniquely horrifying. Arkansas authorities used the case to highlight failures in child protection systems. The years of abuse that occurred without detection prompted calls for better monitoring of alone families. However, the rural nature of Simmons' property and the family's planned being alone made effective stepping in difficult, even with improved systems. The case was cited in academic studies of family annihilation. Researchers noted that Simmons' crimes showed how absolute patriarchal control could create conditions for mass crime. The exploitation of Christmas being alone also became a teaching point for understanding how offenders use holidays to delay discovery. Ronald Gene Simmons was ended by lethal injection on June 25, 1990, less than 3 years after the crimes. His death penalty proceeded without delay because he refused all appeals. He made no final statement expressing remorse or explaining his actions. The property where the crimes occurred was eventually sold. The graves were filled and the land was cleared. No memorial markers were placed on the site, though surviving relatives occasionally visit the area privately. The Arkansas Christmas crimes remain one of the deadliest family annihilations in U.S. history. The case is frequently referenced in criminology courses and behavior analysis training. It illustrates how family being alone can conceal extreme abuse and how holidays can be exploited for tactical advantages. Simmons's calm, careful approach to mass crime challenged assumptions about impulsive violence and showed the ability for kept-up, emotionless ending. Public memory of the case persists in Arkansas, where the crimes shocked a state unaccustomed to such extreme violence. The Christmas timing ensured that the case would be remembered not just for its brutality, but for the betrayal of a holiday associated with family togetherness. What this case reveals extends beyond Simmons' individual problem. It demonstrates that some of the worst violence occurs entirely out of public view, within families that are deliberately alone from outside contact. Christmas being alone in particular creates windows of time where violence can unfold without detection. The case also highlights the intersection of abuse and family annihilation. Simmons' crimes were driven partly by fear of exposure for his inappropriate abuse. The control he kept for decades through intimidation and being alone eventually required violence to preserve. His willingness to end his entire family rather than face accountability illustrated the extreme lengths some offenders will go to maintain dominance. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. While Ronald Gene Simmons ended his family over days of Christmas being alone in the 1980s, the next case takes us back to 1929. When a North Carolina farmer committed one of the earliest recorded Christmas Day attacks in American history. Case 3. Charles Lawson. On Christmas morning, 1929, Charles Davis Lawson ended 7 members of his family at his tobacco farm in Germantown, North Carolina. The victims included his wife, Fannie Lawson, and 6 of his 7 children. The crimes occurred on Christmas morning while the family was at home. After ending his family, Lawson walked into nearby woods and took his own life. The Lawson family Christmas Day crimes became one of the earliest nationally reported Christmas mass crimes in American history. The case occurred during the early 20th century, when family annihilation was rarely discussed publicly. The brutality of the crimes and the Christmas timing created widespread shock across North Carolina and beyond. Charles Lawson ended his family with a shotgun, carefully shooting each victim at close range. The crimes began shortly after the family had gathered for Christmas Day. Lawson shot his wife first, then systematically hunted down his children across the property. Some victims were ended inside the house, others were shot while attempting to flee into the surrounding fields. The youngest victim was an infant. Lawson's eldest son, Arthur, was not present at the property during the crimes. He had been sent into town on an errand earlier that morning. Arthur's absence likely saved his life. When he returned home, he discovered the bodies and alerted authorities. The motive for the crimes remained unclear. Lawson left no written explanation. Neighbours later reported that he had shown strange behaviour in the weeks leading up to Christmas, but no one expected violence. The combination of Christmas Day timing and the complete extermination of a family created a tragedy that resonated nationally. The case occurred in rural North Carolina, where law enforcement resources were limited and forensic investigation was primitive. Investigators relied on witness statements from neighbours and the surviving son. Physical evidence was minimal by modern standards. The shotgun used in the crimes was found near Lawson's body in the woods, confirming his responsibility. The Lawson family Christmas Day crimes marked one of the first instances in American history where a Christmas family gathering became the setting for mass crime. The case influenced early criminology discussions about family violence and the mental stressors that could lead to familicide. In his adult years, Lawson married Fanny Manring, and the couple settled on a farm in Stokes County, North Carolina. They had 7 children over the years. The family lived in relative being alone, normal of rural farming families in the early 20th century. Lawson worked as a tobacco farmer and labourer, providing basic support for his household. Neighbours and community members knew Lawson as a quiet, hard-working man. He was not socially active and kept mostly to himself. He attended church occasionally, but was not deeply involved in religious or community activities. Those who knew him described him as reserved, rather than overtly troubled. In the months leading up to Christmas 1929, Lawson's behaviour began to change. Neighbours noticed that he seemed withdrawn and distracted. He spoke less frequently and avoided social interaction. Some relatives later recalled that he appeared preoccupied or anxious, though no one identified these behaviours as warning signs of violence. Weeks before the tragedy, in early December 1929, Lawson took his family into town to purchase new clothing. This was unusual because the family had limited financial resources and rarely bought new items. Lawson bought outfits for his wife and children, ensuring that everyone had presentable clothing. He then arranged for a formal family photograph to be taken. The photograph showed the entire family dressed in their new clothing, posing together in a studio. It was one of the only professional photographs the family ever had taken. Lawson's decision to arrange this photograph just weeks before the crimes later took on ominous significance. Lawson had no known criminal history. He had never been arrested or charged with any offence. He had no history of domestic violence complaints, protection orders, or legal disputes. From a legal perspective, there was no basis for law enforcement to monitor or intervene in his life. The economic context of 1929 likely contributed to Lawson's getting worse mental state. The stock market crash of October 1929 triggered a national economic collapse. Although Lawson was a rural farmer with limited direct exposure to financial markets, the broader economic downturn affected agricultural communities. Crop prices fell and access to credit tightened. Farmers across the country faced severe financial insecurity. However, there was no direct evidence that Lawson faced financial ruin. He was not deeply in debt, and his farm was not at risk of foreclosure. The economic pressure was general rather than acute. Lawson's deterioration appeared to be mental rather than purely financial. Some later accounts speculated about possible abuse within the family, though these claims were never substantiated. No evidence emerged during the investigation to confirm such abuse. The motive for the crimes remained largely unexplained. The crimes committed by Charles Lawson crossed the threshold for capital punishment under North Carolina law in 1929. Multiple planned crimes, especially those involving minor children, met the legal standard for death penalty. However, Lawson's taking his own life removed the possibility of trial or sentencing. The planning indicators were subtle but present. Lawson's decision to purchase new clothing for the family and arrange a formal photograph suggested some level of premeditation. These actions occurred weeks before the crimes, indicating that Lawson had been contemplating the crimes for some time. The Christmas timing ensured that the entire family would be gathered at home. Christmas Day was one of the few occasions when the family would not be working in the fields or engaged in labour. The holiday guaranteed that all family members, including the children, would be present at the property. Lawson exploited this predictable gathering to carry out the crimes. There was no government or social pressure that directly triggered the crimes. Lawson was not facing legal action, eviction, or legal case. The economic strain following the 1929 crash created general anxiety, but it did not constitute a right-away threat to Lawson's survival or livelihood. The attackers themselves were careful. Lawson began by shooting his wife inside the house. He then hunted down his children one by one. Some victims were shot while hiding, others were ended while attempting to flee. The organised nature of the crimes showed a planned death penalty rather than impulsive rage. Lawson used a shotgun, firing at close range to ensure lethality. The weapon was normal for rural farming households, used for hunting and pest control. Its availability made it the natural choice for the crimes. After completing the crimes, Lawson walked into nearby woods. He sat down and placed the shotgun under his chin. He took his own life. His body was discovered later that day by searchers who had been alerted by Arthur Lawson. The family photograph taken in early December 1929 showed 7 Lawson children and their parents dressed in new clothing. The children ranged in age from infancy to late teens. All appeared healthy and clean. The photograph was formal, with the family arranged in rows. Charles Lawson stood at the back, unsmiling. Fanny Lawson sat in the centre, with the youngest child on her lap. The photograph was taken at a local studio in Germantown. Lawson's decision to purchase new clothing represented a large financial expenditure for a tobacco farmer in 1929. The family rarely had money for non-needed items. Neighbours later recalled being surprised when they saw the Lawson children in new clothes. Some interpreted it as a sign that the family's finances had improved. Others found it unusual given the economic climate. The crimes on Christmas morning began around 11 a.m. Fanny Lawson was shot first while she was in the house preparing the midday meal. The shotgun blast was heard by neighbours, but the distance was too great for them to investigate immediately. Charles Lawson then systematically hunted his children. Some were ended inside the house, others fled into the tobacco fields and were shot while running. The youngest victim was an infant, shot at close range. Teenage daughters were ended while attempting to hide in outbuildings. One son was shot while climbing a fence, trying to reach the main road. The organised nature of the crimes showed that Lawson moved deliberately, reloading as needed and ensuring that each victim was deadly wounded before moving to the next. Arthur Lawson, the eldest son, had been sent into town that morning to purchase supplies. The errand likely saved his life. When he returned home in the early afternoon, he found his mother's body first. He then discovered his siblings scattered across the property. Arthur immediately ran to a neighbour's house to report the crimes. Local authorities arrived within the hour. There was no arrest or capture in the Lawson family Christmas Day crimes because Charles Lawson took his own life immediately after ending his family. Law enforcement arrived at the property after Arthur Lawson, the surviving son, discovered the bodies and reported the crimes. Investigators found 7 bodies, Fanny Lawson and 6 children. The victims ranged in age from infancy to teenagers. All had been ended by shotgun blasts. The crime scene was chaotic, with victims found both inside the house and in the surrounding yard. The manner of death showed at close-range crimes rather than a struggle. Authorities searched the surrounding area for Charles Lawson. His body was found in nearby woods, seated against a tree with the shotgun beside him. The wound was consistent with took his own life to the head. Lawson had died hours earlier, shortly after completing the crimes. Evidence seized from the scene included the shotgun, spent shell casings, and the bodies of the victims. Investigators also found the new clothing Lawson had bought for the family, still relatively clean despite the violence. The formal family photograph was discovered inside the house, adding to the eerie circumstances. The right-away aftermath of the discovery devastated the local community. News of the crimes spread rapidly through Stokes County and across North Carolina. The Christmas timing got stronger to the public's horror. Families celebrating the holiday were confronted with the reality that a similar tragedy had occurred just miles away. The investigation into the Lawson family Christmas Day crimes was straightforward due to Lawson's taking his own life and the clear evidence at the scene. Investigators proved that Charles Lawson acted alone and that no other individuals were involved in the crimes. Ballistic examination was rudimentary by modern standards, but investigators proved that the shotgun found near Lawson's body matched the wounds on the victims. Shell casings at the scene corresponded to the shotgun's caliber and type. Autopsy showed that all victims died from close-range shotgun blasts. The wounds showed that Lawson had shot each victim deliberately, ensuring deadly injuries. There were no defensive wounds on the victims, suggesting they had been taken by surprise or were unable to defend themselves. The witness statement came primarily from Arthur Lawson, the surviving son. He described his father's recent behaviour changes, including increased withdrawal and mood swings. Arthur also recounted the unusual decision to purchase new clothing and arrange the family photograph, which seemed out of character for his father. Neighbours provided additional context. They proved that Charles Lawson had seemed troubled in the weeks before Christmas, but had not made threats or showed overtly violent behaviour. No one reported suspecting that Lawson might harm his family. There was no confession because Lawson died before authorities could question him. He left no taking his own life note or written explanation for the crimes. Investigators searched the property for any documents that might reveal a motive, but none were found. The reasons for the crimes remained speculative. Financial evidence showed that Lawson faced general economic stress consistent with the 1929 economic collapse. but he was not in a right-away financial crisis. His farm was not foreclosed, and he had no large debts that would have driven him to desperation. Some later accounts suggested that Lawson may have abused one of his daughters, and that the crimes were an attempt to conceal this abuse. However, no evidence emerged during the 1929 investigation to support this theory. It remained speculative and unproven. Investigators concluded that Lawson ended his family intentionally and carefully, then took his own life. The Christmas timing was exploited to ensure the family was gathered at home, but the underlying motive remained unclear. Had Lawson survived, he would have faced multiple counts of first-degree crime under North Carolina law. The planned nature of the crimes, the targeting of minor children, and the absence of any justifiable motive would have supported capital charges. North Carolina permitted the death penalty in 1929, and Lawson's crimes would have met the threshold for death penalty. The crimes involved multiple victims, including helpless children. The organised death penalty of each family member showed extreme cruelty. These factors would have been central to any legal case. The legal classification of the case was familicide, combined with taking his own life. Investigators officially closed the case as crime taking his own life, with Lawson identified as the sole attacker. No accomplices were suspected, and no further legal trial occurred. Charles Lawson received no sentence because he died before arrest. However, the Lawson family Christmas Day crimes had a lasting impact on North Carolina and on early criminology discussions about family violence. The case was widely reported in newspapers across the United States. It became one of the earliest instances of a Christmas family attack receiving national attention. The juxtaposition of holiday celebration with brutal family annihilation created a narrative that shocked readers unfamiliar with such extreme domestic violence. Surviving family members, particularly Arthur Lawson, struggled with lifelong trauma. Arthur gave occasional interviews reflecting on the crimes and the mental impact of losing his entire family. He described the difficulty of moving forward after such a terrible loss and the persistent questions about why his father had committed the crimes. The case contributed to early criminology discussions about the mental stressors that could lead to familicide. Researchers noted that economic collapse, social being alone, and untreated mental illness could combine to create conditions for extreme violence. The Lawson case became a reference point for these discussions. The property where the crimes occurred became a site of public fascination. For decades, visitors travelled to the site out of morbid curiosity. The house itself was eventually torn down, but the location remained known within the community. The case permanently altered public perception of Christmas as an inviolable family safe space. The idea that a holiday gathering could end in mass crime challenged assumptions about the sanctity of Christmas celebrations. The Lawson crimes showed that holidays could be exploited for violence, not just celebrated peacefully. The case remains closed. Charles Lawson is deceased, and all legal trial concluded with his death. The property where the crimes occurred has changed ownership multiple times, and no physical remnants of the original house remain. The Lawson family Christmas Day crimes are referenced in books, documentaries, and true crime discussions about early American family annihilations. The case is cited as one of the first nationally recognized Christmas mass crimes, predating more recent cases by decades. Cultural impact persists in North Carolina, where the crimes are remembered as a defining tragedy. Local historians preserve records of the case, and descendants of the surviving son occasionally share their family's experience. The formal family photograph taken weeks before the crimes remains a haunting artifact, symbolizing the normalcy that preceded terrible violence. What this case reveals extends beyond Charles Lawson's individual actions. It demonstrates that economic collapse can amplify mental breakdown, especially in alone rural families. The lack of emotional health resources in 1929 meant that individuals experiencing severe distress had few options for stepping in or treatment. The case also illustrates how total familial authority can become lethal. Charles Lawson exercised complete control over his household. His wife and children were economically dependent on him and had no means of escape. This power imbalance created conditions where violence could unfold without resistance or stepping in. Christmas being alone played a central role. The holiday ensured that the family was gathered at home, with no outside visitors or work obligations. This isolation provided Lawson with the opportunity to carry out the crimes without right-away detection. The Christmas timing was tactical, even if the motive remained unclear. The Lawson family Christmas Day crimes remain a historical example of how holidays can be used as a weapon, and how family gatherings can become sites of extreme violence when underlying mental and social stresses go unaddressed. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. While Charles Lawson's 1929 crimes represent one of America's earliest Christmas attacks, the next case shows how this pattern repeated itself decades later in Eastern Europe, with even more victims. Case 4. Anatoly Onoprienko. On December 24, 1996, Anatoly Yurievich Onoprienko ended an entire family in their home in Ukraine. The victims included parents and children who were gathered for Christmas Eve. This attack was part of a larger series of crimes that spanned several months and finally reached 52 proven victims. Onoprienko became known nationally as the Beast of Ukraine and the Terminator. The Christmas Eve crimes horrified Ukraine because they occurred during a night traditionally dedicated to family gatherings and religious observance. Onoprienko exploited the holiday to ensure that all family members would be present in one location. The attack followed his set-up pattern of targeting entire households, leaving no survivors who could identify him. Onoprienko ended with extreme efficiency, using firearms and blunt instruments. He entered homes at night, overpowered victims quickly, and ended them systematically. The Christmas Eve family was ended in the same manner as his previous victims. Onoprienko shot adults first to eliminate resistance, then ended children to ensure no witnesses remained. The crimes went undetected for hours because the family lived in a rural area with limited neighbours. By the time relatives discovered the bodies, Onoprienko had already fled the region. The being alone of the Christmas Eve timing delayed discovery and allowed him to escape. Onoprienko's total victim count of 52 made him one of the most prolific serial attackers in European history. His crimes spanned multiple regions of Ukraine, terrorizing communities across the country. The Christmas Eve crimes were particularly notorious because they showed his willingness to attack families during a sacred holiday. The case exposed severe weaknesses in Ukrainian law enforcement coordination. Regional police departments did not share information effectively, allowing Onoprienko to move between jurisdictions without detection. The lack of centralized tracking meant that patterns linking the crimes were not identified until many victims had already been ended. Anatoly Yurievich Onoprienko was born in 1959 in Lasky, Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union. His mother died when he was young, and his father struggled to care for him and his brother. Onoprienko was eventually sent to an orphanage, where he spent much of his childhood. Life in Soviet orphanages was harsh. Children received minimal feeling support and faced strict discipline. Onoprienko later described feelings of abandonment and resentment toward his father for placing him in institutional care. These early experiences contributed to his social detachment and inability to form stable relationships. Upon entering adulthood, Onoprienko struggled to integrate into society. He completed his education and served in the Soviet military, but he had difficulty maintaining employment after his discharge. He worked various manual labor jobs, but was frequently fired or quit due to conflicts with co-workers. Onoprienko began committing violent crimes in the late 1980s. His early crimes targeted individuals rather than families. He ended opportunistically, selecting victims based on accessibility rather than personal connection. These initial crimes went unsolved because Soviet law enforcement was fragmented and lacked the resources to investigate thoroughly. As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine entered a period of political and economic instability. Law enforcement agencies were underfunded and disorganized. This chaos created conditions where violent offenders like Onoprienko could operate with reduced risk of detection. Onoprienko's violence grew worse in the mid-1990s. He transitioned from ending individuals to exterminating entire households. This shift was tactical, not feeling. He recognized that leaving survivors increased the risk of identification. By ending everyone in a home, he removed witnesses and delayed discovery. He operated entirely alone. He had no accomplices, no criminal organization, and no ideological motivation. His crimes were not committed for political reasons, financial gain, or sexual gratification. He ended because he wanted to exert total control over his victims and because he enjoyed the power that violence provided. Onoprienko's rise was defined by unchecked escalation rather than organizational power. Onoprienko's time in Soviet orphanages lasted from about age 4 until his late teens. Soviet orphanages during the 1960s and 1970s were overcrowded and underfunded. Children received basic shelter and food, but little feeling support. Discipline was harsh, and physical punishment was common. Onoprienko later described the orphanage as a place where he learned to suppress emotion and view others as obstacles rather than companions. After leaving the orphanage, Onoprienko attempted to reconnect with his father and brother. However, the relationships remained strained. Onoprienko blamed his father for abandoning him to institutional care. His brother had been allowed to remain with family, creating resentment that persisted into adulthood. Onoprienko kept limited contact with his brother, but never reconciled with his father. His early crimes in the late 1980s targeted random victims. He ended a couple parked in a remote area, shooting them both and stealing their car. He ended a lone traveller on a rural road, taking money and valuables. These crimes were opportunistic rather than planned. Onoprienko selected victims based on weakness and accessibility. The crimes went unsolved because Soviet law enforcement lacked the resources and coordination to link crimes across regions. The transition to family annihilation occurred in the mid-1990s. Onoprienko realized that ending entire households removed witnesses and delayed discovery. He began selecting alone homes where families lived alone. He attacked at night, forcing entry through windows or unlocked doors. He ended adults first to neutralize resistance, then carefully ended children and elderly family members. No survivors meant no descriptions, no evidence of his methods, and no right-away alerts to authorities. By late 1996, Onoprienko had developed a consistent pattern. He used firearms for adults and blunt instruments for children to reduce noise. He stole valuables from the homes to finance his continued movement between regions. He burned some houses to destroy evidence. Each successful attack increased his confidence and willingness to take greater risks. He grew bolder as he evaded capture. Each successful attack increased his confidence and willingness to take risks. By late 1996, he was attacking families in populated areas, confident that law enforcement could not stop him. The crimes committed by Anatoly Onoprienko fully met the threshold for capital punishment under Ukrainian law at the time. His repeated mass crimes, targeting of children, and multi-region ending spree made him one of the most severe criminal cases in Ukrainian history. As the year drew to a close, by December 1996, Onoprienko had already ended dozens of people. His crimes followed a consistent pattern. He selected alone homes, attacked at night, and ended everyone inside. He used firearms to end adults quickly, and blunt instruments to end children silently. The Christmas Eve crimes in 1996 followed this exact pattern. Onoprienko identified a family gathering for the holiday. He waited until late in the evening when the household had settled for the night. He forced entry through a window or door, overpowered the adults, and systematically ended every person in the home. The exploitation of Christmas Eve was planned. Families gathered during the holiday were predictable targets. Reduced outside activity and limited traffic meant fewer witnesses. The feeling of significance of the holiday also delayed outside contact, as relatives assumed the family was simply celebrating privately. Onoprienko's behavior escalation was evident in the frequency and boldness of his attacks. In the months leading up to Christmas 1996, he was ending at an accelerated pace. He attacked households in different regions, moving quickly to avoid detection. His willingness to target families during Christmas Eve showed his complete lack of fear or hesitation. There was no government pressure or external threat that triggered the Christmas Eve crimes. Onoprienko was not being actively pursued at that specific moment. He attacked because he wanted to continue ending, and Christmas Eve provided favourable conditions. Law enforcement pressure did increase after the Christmas Eve crimes. National media began covering the case extensively, and political leaders demanded results. Regional police departments were forced to coordinate more effectively, though this coordination came too late to prevent dozens of additional deaths. Watching and manhunt efforts got stronger in early 1997 as authorities finally connected the crimes across regions. However, Onoprienko continued evading capture for several more months. His ability to move between communities and blend into rural areas made him difficult to track. Anatoly Onoprienko was arrested in April 1996 after a surviving victim from an earlier attack identified him. The victim had escaped during one of Onoprienko's assaults and provided a detailed description to police. This description eventually led investigators to focus on Onoprienko as a suspect. Police located Onoprienko in a small town where he had been living under a false identity. He was taken into custody during a coordinated operation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. He did not resist arrest violently, but showed no emotion when confronted by police. Onoprienko's capture ended one of the largest manhunts in Ukrainian history. Evidence seized during his arrest included firearms, later linked by ballistics to multiple crime scenes. Investigators also recovered stolen property taken from victims' homes. Onoprienko had kept items as trophies, providing direct physical evidence connecting him to the crimes. The right-away aftermath of his arrest generated nationwide media attention. Ukrainian citizens had been terrorized by the unsolved crimes for months. The revelation that a single individual was responsible for dozens of crimes shocked the public and prompted questions about law enforcement failures. The investigation into Anatoly Onoprienko's crimes proved that he was responsible for at least 52 crimes across multiple regions of Ukraine. Forensic evidence linked him definitively to the crimes, and his confession provided additional details. Ballistic analysis matched firearms recovered from Onoprienko's possession to bullets extracted from victims at many crime scenes. Firing pin marks, rifling patterns, and shell casing characteristics were consistent across cases, spanning different regions and time periods. This forensic connection was important in establishing the full scope of his crimes. Stolen valuables traced back to Onoprienko provided additional physical evidence. Items taken from victims' homes were found in his possession or traced through sales and pawning records. These items included jewelry, electronics, and personal belongings that definitively linked him to specific households. Witness statement came from surviving victims who had escaped Onoprienko's earlier attacks. These individuals provided descriptions of the attacker and details about his methods. Their statement corroborated forensic findings and helped establish timelines for the crimes. Onoprienko confessed to dozens of crimes during questioning. He spoke calmly and without remorse, describing his attacks in detail. He explained his targeting methods, his use of firearms and blunt instruments, and his decision to end entire families to eliminate witnesses. He showed no emotion while recounting the crimes. Onoprienko never expressed remorse or acknowledged the suffering of his victims. He described ending as something he enjoyed and stated that he felt powerful when he took lives. His statements during questioning showed a complete absence of empathy and a fixation on control and dominance. Investigators concluded that the Christmas Eve crimes were planned attacks designed to exploit holiday being alone. Onoprienko had specifically targeted families during Christmas to ensure they were gathered at home and to delay discovery. The crimes were not incidental. They were strategically planned. Anatoly Onoprienko was charged with 52 counts of crime, along with additional charges related to theft, illegal weapons possession, and destruction of property. His trial began in late 1998 and was one of the most closely watched legal trials in post-Soviet Ukraine. The legal case presented overwhelming evidence, including ballistic analysis, stolen property, witness statements, and Onoprienko's own confessions. The case was straightforward from an evidentiary perspective. Onoprienko's guilt was not in serious dispute. The defense attempted to argue that Onoprienko suffered from mental illness and should be found not guilty by reason of mental illness. Emotional health evaluations were conducted, but experts concluded that while Onoprienko showed antisocial personality traits, he understood the nature of his actions and was legally sane at the time of the crimes. Onoprienko showed no emotion during the trial. He sat calmly throughout the trial, occasionally smirking when evidence was presented. He did not react to victim impact statements or statements from surviving relatives. His detachment reinforced the legal case's argument that he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The courtroom statement included graphic descriptions of the crimes and the suffering of the victims. Families of the deceased gave statements describing the impact of losing entire households. The feeling weight of the statement contrasted sharply with Onoprienko's indifference. The jury found Onoprienko guilty on all counts. The evidence was incontrovertible, and his confessions removed any doubt about his responsibility. The trial moved to the sentencing phase. Anatoly Onoprienko was sentenced to life imprisonment. Ukraine had abolished the death penalty in 2000, so the death penalty was not an option. However, the sentence ensured that Onoprienko would never be released. He was sent to a maximum security prison where he would remain for the rest of his life. The government used the case to justify reforms in law enforcement coordination. The failure to detect Onoprienko's crimes earlier exposed serious weaknesses in interregional communication and centralized tracking systems. Ukrainian authorities put in place new protocols for sharing information about violent crimes across jurisdictions. Surviving family members reported permanent trauma. Relatives of victims described the mental devastation of losing entire households. The Christmas Eve crimes in particular left survivors unable to celebrate the holiday without reliving the trauma. Annual memorials were held, though the pain of the losses never diminished. The case generated large media coverage in Ukraine and internationally. Onoprienko's high victim count and the Christmas Eve timing made the case particularly notorious. Comparisons were drawn to other serial attackers in Europe, though Onoprienko's willingness to target entire families distinguished him from most other offenders. Appeals were filed on Onoprienko's behalf, but all were denied. The evidence supporting his guilty decision was too strong to be overturned. He remained in prison without any realistic possibility of release. Anatoly Onoprienko died in prison on August 27, 2013. He died of heart failure at the age of 54. His death ended one of the most notorious criminal cases in Ukrainian history. The political consequences of the case extended beyond law enforcement reform. The crimes highlighted the chaos and instability that plagued Ukraine in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The inability to detect and stop Onoprienko for so long became a symbol of institutional failure. Public memory of the case remains strong in Ukraine. The Christmas Eve crimes are remembered as one of the most horrifying examples of how holidays can be exploited for violence. Annual commemorations honor the victims, and the case continues to be referenced in discussions about serial violence and law enforcement coordination. What this case reveals extends beyond Onoprienko's individual crimes. It demonstrates that extreme violence does not require ideology, organization, or even clear motive. Onoprienko ended for the sake of power and control, not for money, political reasons, or revenge. His crimes were expressions of dominance, carried out carefully over months. The Christmas Eve timing illustrates how holidays provide tactical advantages for offenders. Families gathered at home are concentrated targets. Reduced outside activity delays discovery. Feeling associations with holidays lower vigilance and create opportunities for violence. The case also exposes the dangers of fragmented law enforcement. Onoprienko operated across multiple regions without detection because police departments did not communicate effectively. This failure allowed him to continue ending long after patterns should have been identified. Make sure to subscribe before the next case. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. While Anatoly Onoprienko exploited Christmas Eve being alone to commit serial family attacks, the next attacker used as a weapon the holiday itself in an act of ideologically driven terrorism that targeted hundreds of innocent travelers on Christmas Day. Case 5. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab. On Christmas Day 2009, Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab attempted to explode an explosive device aboard Northwest Airlines Flight 253. The flight was travelling from Amsterdam to Detroit, carrying 289 passengers and crew. Abdulmutallab had sewn the explosive into his underwear, intending to trigger it during the plane's descent. The device partially started, but failed to fully explode. Passengers and crew members immediately subdued Abdulmutallab, preventing a terrible explosion. The aircraft landed safely in Detroit, and Abdulmutallab was taken into custody. This was immediately classified as a terrorist attack, not a symbolic or incidental Christmas event. Abdulmutallab was affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a terrorist organization based in Yemen. The group had trained him, provided the explosive device, and selected Christmas Day as the target date. The timing was planned, chosen to maximize global media attention and symbolic impact. The attack became known worldwide as the Christmas Day bombing or the underwear bomber event. It exposed large gaps in aviation security and intelligence sharing. Abdulmutallab had been flagged by intelligence agencies before the attack, but he was not placed on a no-fly list or prevented from boarding the aircraft. The failure of the explosive device likely prevented one of the deadliest terrorist attacks since September 11, 2001. Had the device functioned as designed, the entire aircraft would have been destroyed, ending everyone on board. The Christmas timing would have amplified the mental impact, as families worldwide were celebrating the holiday. Abdulmutallab's attack was part of a broader Al-Qaeda strategy to target Western aviation. The group sought to exploit perceived weaknesses in airport security systems. The use of an explosive sewn into clothing was designed to bypass metal detectors and body scanners. Christmas Day was selected because holiday travel volumes were at their peak, creating chaos and fear among millions of passengers. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib was born on December 22, 1986, in Lagos, Nigeria. He was raised in a wealthy and influential family. His father, Alhaji Umaru Muttalib, was a prominent banker and former Nigerian government minister. The family lived in affluence, and Abdul Muttalib attended elite schools. Abdul Muttalib's upbringing was stable and privileged. He had access to high-quality education, financial security, and social status. His background made him an atypical profile for a terrorist operative. Most individuals involved in violent extremism come from marginalised or impoverished backgrounds, but Abdul Muttalib had every advantage. He attended the British International School in Lomé, Togo, and later enrolled at University College London, where he studied mechanical engineering. His academic performance was enough, though he became increasingly alone during his time abroad. Abdul Muttalib's radicalisation began while he was studying in the United Kingdom. He broke contact with his family and stopped attending regular social activity. He became fixated on extremist interpretations of Islam and began consuming propaganda produced by Al-Qaeda. His transformation from a privileged student to a violent extremist occurred gradually over several years. During that pivotal year, in 2009, Abdul Muttalib travelled to Yemen, where he was recruited and trained by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The group provided him with explosives training, ideological indoctrination, and specific instructions for carrying out an attack. He came under the direct influence of Anwar al-Awlaki, a prominent Al-Qaeda cleric who directed operations from Yemen. Abdul Muttalib's father became concerned about his son's radicalization. In November 2009, just weeks before the Christmas Day attack, Alhaji Umaru Muttalib went to the US Embassy in Abuja, Nigeria, and he warned US officials that his son had become radicalized, was living in Yemen, and might pose a security threat. This warning was entered into US intelligence databases, but Abdul Muttalib was not placed on a no-fly list. The failure to act on this warning became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. US intelligence agencies had specific information about Abdul Muttalib's radicalization, but bureaucratic failures and lack of coordination prevented effective stepping in. Abdul Muttalib's entry into terrorist activity was helped by Al-Qaeda's recruitment networks. The organization identified him as a valuable operative because of his Western education, Nigerian passport, and clean criminal record. He could travel to the United States without raising right-away suspicion, making him an ideal candidate for an aviation attack. The crimes committed by Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib met the threshold for capital punishment under US federal law. Attempted mass crime, terrorism, and the use of a weapon of mass destruction are all capital-level offences. Although no one died in the attack, the intended casualties were enormous. Abdul Muttalib's plan involved exploding 80 grams of PETN, a highly explosive compound. Had the device functioned correctly, it would have caused terrible structural failure of the aircraft. All 289 passengers and crew would have been ended, and debris would have fallen on populated areas below. The selection of Christmas Day was strategic, not incidental. Al-Qaeda leadership recognised that attacking on December 25th would maximise global media coverage. Millions of people were travelling during the holiday period, creating widespread fear and disruption. The Christmas timing also carried symbolic weight, representing an attack on Western cultural and religious traditions. Abdul Muttalib's planning behaviours were large. He travelled to Yemen, underwent weeks of training in bomb construction and operational security, and received the explosive device from AQAP facilitators. The PETN was carefully sewn into his underwear to avoid detection by airport security. He bought a one-way ticket to Detroit using cash, a red flag that should have triggered additional scrutiny. However, he was allowed to board the flight without enhanced screening. His name was in US intelligence databases, but the information was not acted upon. Post 9/11 aviation security measures made successful attacks difficult, but not impossible. Al-Qaeda sought to bypass visible security systems by concealing explosives in locations that scanners would not detect. The underwear bomb was designed specifically to evade metal detectors. At the time, full-body scanners were not widely deployed in European airports. Abdul Muttalib boarded the flight in Amsterdam after connecting from Lagos. He passed through security checkpoints without event. Once aboard, he waited until the aircraft was descending toward Detroit before attempting to explode the device. The device partially started, causing a small fire and burns to Abdulmutallab's legs. Passengers sitting nearby heard a popping sound and saw flames. They immediately tackled Abdulmutallab and put out the fire using blankets and a fire extinguisher. Crew members restrained him for the remainder of the flight. The failure of the explosive device likely saved the lives of everyone on board. Technical analysis later showed that the PETN had degraded due to improper handling or storage. The ignition system activated, but the main charge did not fully explode. This malfunction was accidental, not the result of effective security measures. Abdulmutallab's training in Yemen lasted several weeks during 2009. He arrived in Sana'a, the capital, before travelling to remote mountainous regions where AQAP kept training camp. These camps operated in areas with limited government control, taking advantage of Yemen's political instability and weak law enforcement presence. The training covered multiple aspects of terrorist operations. Abdulmutallab received instruction in bomb construction, focusing specifically on PETN-based explosives. He learned how to measure and handle the compound safely, how to construct ignition systems using syringes and chemical detonators, and how to conceal explosives in clothing. The training emphasized methods for bypassing airport security systems. Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born cleric who had become a senior AQAP operative, played a direct role in Abdulmutallab's radicalization and operational preparation. Al-Awlaki provided ideological justification for targeting civilians and framed the attack as a religious obligation. He also helped select the target date and provided strategic guidance on maximizing mental impact. Al-Awlaki's fluency in English and understanding of Western culture made him particularly effective at recruiting and directing operatives like Abdulmutallab. The explosive device sewn into Abdulmutallab's underwear contained about 80 grams of PETN mixed with other compounds. The mixture was designed to create terrible structural failure if it exploded successfully. The device was constructed by Ibrahim al-Asiri, AQAP's chief bomb maker. Al-Asiri had developed sophisticated techniques for concealing explosives in ways that evaded metal detectors and normal screening methods. The underwear bomb represented his response to increased aviation security following earlier failed attempts. Abdulmutallab's travel from Yemen to Nigeria and then to Amsterdam was carefully planned to avoid detection. He flew from Sana'a to Lagos without event. In Lagos, he bought a one-way ticket to Detroit via Amsterdam using cash. This payment method was intended to avoid creating financial records that could be traced. However, cash purchases combined with one-way international tickets typically trigger additional scrutiny. The failure to flag Abdulmutallab at this stage represented a large security breakdown. During the flight from Amsterdam to Detroit, Abdulmutallab behaved normally until the descent phase. He remained seated, spoke minimally with other passengers, and drew no attention. Flight attendants later reported that he had seemed calm and unremarkable. When the aircraft began its descent toward Detroit, Abdulmutallab went to the lavatory, where he attempted to activate the device. The ignition system partially functioned, but the main charge failed to explode fully, likely due to degradation of the explosive compound. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab was restrained by passengers and crew members during the final minutes of Northwest Airlines Flight 253's descent. He was held until the aircraft landed at Detroit Metropolitan Airport on December 25, 2009. Law enforcement officers boarded the plane immediately upon landing and took Abdulmutallab into custody. He did not resist arrest. He was transported to a hospital for treatment of burns to his legs and groin area caused by the partial ignition of the explosive device. While under medical care, he was questioned by FBI agents. Abdulmutallab confessed openly and described the attack as religiously motivated. He stated that he was acting on behalf of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and that the attack was intended to end everyone on board the aircraft. He expressed no remorse and described the mission as a form of jihad. His willingness to confess surprised investigators, though his statements provided important evidence for the legal case. Evidence seized from Abdulmutallab included his underwear with the sewn-in explosive device, chemical residue, and burned clothing. Forensic teams proved the presence of PETN and analysed the ignition system. The device's construction matched techniques used by AQAP bomb makers. Investigators also recovered Abdulmutallab's passport, travel documents, and electronic devices. These items provided information about his movements in the weeks before the attack and proved his travel to Yemen. Financial records showed that he had bought the ticket with cash, avoiding the use of credit cards, that would have created a clearer trail. The right-away aftermath of the arrest triggered global aviation security alerts. Airports worldwide increased screening procedures, and passengers faced longer wait times and enhanced searches. The event prompted right-away policy changes, including the deployment of full-body scanners at major airports. The investigation into the Christmas Day airline attack proved that Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab acted on behalf of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. His confession, forensic evidence, and intelligence records set up a clear timeline and motive. Chemical analysis proved that the explosive device contained about 80 grams of PETN, a military-grade compound. The design of the device matched known AQAP techniques, including the use of a syringe-based ignition system. The device had been carefully sewn into Abdulmutallab's underwear to avoid detection during security screening. The bomb design was nearly identical to devices used in previous AQAP attacks. Investigators linked the construction to Ibrahim al-Asiri, a known AQAP bomb maker responsible for multiple aviation plots. This connection proved that the attack was directed by senior AQAP leadership, rather than being a lone wolf operation. Digital and financial trails provided additional evidence. Abdulmutallab's travel history showed that he had flown from Lagos to Amsterdam before boarding the Detroit-bound flight. Communications intercepts showed that AQAP operatives had been in contact with him in the weeks before the attack, providing final instructions and encouragement. Witness statements came from passengers and crew members who subdued Abdulmutallab during the attack. These individuals described his behaviour, the sound and appearance of the ignition, and their right-away response. Their actions were credited with preventing a terrible explosion. Abdulmutallab never denied responsibility. During interrogations and throughout the legal trial, he kept that the attack was justified and that he would have succeeded if the device had functioned properly. He expressed pride in his actions and described his participation as an honour. Intelligence agencies reviewed their handling of the warnings provided by Abdulmutallab's father. The investigation showed that information had been entered into databases, but had not been acted upon. This failure prompted reforms in how intelligence is shared and prioritised across agencies. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab was charged with multiple federal offences, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction, attempted crime, and terrorism-related crimes. The charges carried potential life sentences. The legal case was straightforward. Abdulmutallab had confessed, forensic evidence proved the presence of explosives, and a witness statement set up his intent to end everyone on board. The defence had limited options for challenging the facts of the case. Abdulmutallab initially cooperated with authorities, but later rejected plea negotiations. He insisted that his actions were religiously justified and that he should not be punished for carrying out what he believed was a real act of war. This ideological rigidity complicated defence efforts and removed possibilities for reduced sentencing through cooperation. The trial was held in federal court in Detroit. Abdulmutallab represented himself during portions of the trial, using the courtroom as a platform to express his extremist views. He remained calm and composed, showing no remorse or regret. Prosecutors argued that Abdulmutallab's intent was clear: to end hundreds of people and create terror. They presented evidence of his training in Yemen, his planned selection of Christmas Day, and his complete lack of concern for the lives he intended to take. The legal case sought the maximum possible sentence. The defence attempted to argue that Abdulmutallab's youth and radicalisation should be considered as mitigating factors. However, these arguments had little effect given the severity of the crime and Abdulmutallab's unrepentant attitude. The jury found Abdulmutallab guilty on all counts. The evidence was overwhelming, and his confession removed any doubt about his responsibility. The trial moved to the sentencing phase. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasised the gravity of the crime, the intent to end hundreds, and the complete absence of remorse. The sentence ensured that Abdulmutallab would never be released. The government used the case to demonstrate its commitment to prosecuting terrorism in civilian courts rather than military tribunals. The successful guilty decision and life sentence were cited as evidence that the criminal justice system could handle even the most serious terrorism cases. Abdulmutallab's father publicly condemned the attack. Alhaji Umaru Mutallab expressed grief over his son's actions and emphasised that he had tried to warn authorities. His statements highlighted the personal tragedy of radicalisation and the devastation it causes to families. The case prompted large policy changes in aviation security. Full-body scanners were deployed at airports worldwide. Passenger screening procedures were enhanced, particularly for international flights. Intelligence sharing protocols were reformed to ensure that warnings like the one provided by Abdulmuttalib's father would trigger right-away action. The Christmas Day timing had a lasting impact on holiday travel security. Passengers flying on December 25th and surrounding days now face elevated security measures. The attack showed that holidays are not deterrents to terrorism, but can be exploited for maximum symbolic and practical impact. Appeals were filed on Abdulmuttalib's behalf, but the guilty decision was upheld. The evidence supporting his guilt was incontrovertible, and no legal errors were identified that would justify overturning the decision. Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib is serving a life sentence in a maximum security federal prison in the United States. He is held under strict conditions designed for high-risk terrorism offenders. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life with no possibility of release. The political consequences of the case extended beyond aviation security. The attack prompted major reforms in how US intelligence agencies share information about potential threats. The failure to act on the warning from Abdulmuttalib's father became a case study in intelligence coordination failures. The attack is remembered globally as the Christmas Day bomber event. It serves as a reminder that terrorism does not pause for holidays, and that symbolic dates can be deliberately targeted to amplify fear. The exploitation of Christmas Day as a global stage showed Al-Qaeda's strategic thinking about timing and mental impact. What this case reveals extends beyond Abdulmuttalib's individual radicalization. It demonstrates that terrorism can recruit individuals from privileged backgrounds, not just the marginalized or impoverished. Abdulmuttalib had every advantage in life, yet he chose to join in violent extremism. The case also illustrates the limits of intelligence warnings. Even when specific information is provided to authorities, bureaucratic failures can prevent effective action. Abdulmuttalib's father did everything he could to alert officials, but the system failed to respond appropriately. Christmas Day was used as a weapon, as a tool for terror. The holiday's global significance, the concentration of travelers, and the feeling associations with celebration made it an ideal target. The attack transformed December 25th from a day of joy into a reminder of weakness. If these stories are helping you understand the darker side of human nature, subscribe to see more cases we uncover. While Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib's Christmas Day terrorism plot targeted strangers in an ideological attack, the next case returns to domestic violence, when a convicted attacker used Christmas Eve to lure first responders into a deadly ambush. Case 6. William Spengler. On Christmas Eve morning 2012, William Spengler deliberately set fire to his home and a car on Lake Road in Webster, New York. The fire was not an accident. It was bait. Spengler created the emergency to lure first responders into an end zone. When firefighters arrived to extinguish the blaze, Spengler opened fire with a .223 caliber semi-automatic rifle from a hid position. 2 firefighters were ended, Tomasz Kachowka and Michael Chiapparini. 2 others were critically wounded. The shooting occurred at about 5:30 a.m. on Christmas Eve morning, catching the responders completely off guard. Spengler continued firing as additional emergency personnel arrived, forcing them to take cover and delay rescue efforts. The attack shocked the nation because it transformed Christmas Eve emergency response into a death trap. Law enforcement responded with tactical teams, evacuated nearby residents, and engaged Spengler in a prolonged standoff. Hours later, Spengler took his own life. His body was found near the burning property along with weapons, bullets, and a handwritten manifesto. The Christmas Eve firefighter ambush became one of the most infamous attacks on first responders in US. It showed how emergency calls could be used as a weapon and how holidays created predictable response patterns that offenders could exploit. Spengler had a serious criminal history. In 1981, he had took the life of his 92-year-old grandmother. He served about 17 years in prison before being released. Despite this violent past, he faced no active monitoring or restrictions at the time of the Christmas Eve attack. The case raised questions about how convicted attackers can re-emerge to commit terrible violence. Spengler's history should have flagged him as a high-risk individual, but he lived quietly after his release and avoided behaviours that would have justified stepping in. His ability to plan and end a coordinated ambush while evading detection illustrated the limitations of post-release monitoring. William Spengler was born in 1961. His childhood was marked by instability, though specific details about abuse or trauma were not extensively documented. He grew up in Webster, New York, and remained in the area throughout his life. In 1980, Spengler ended his 92-year-old grandmother, Rose Spengler. He harmed his grandmother, ending her life. The motive for the crime was never fully explained, though financial disputes and family tensions were suspected factors. Spengler was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison. He served about 17 years before being released in 1998. His release came with standard parole conditions, but he completed parole without event and faced no ongoing legal restrictions. After his release, Spengler lived reclusively. He kept to himself, avoided social interactions and kept a low profile. Neighbours rarely saw him and described him as withdrawn. He did not work consistently and lived in a property owned by his family. Spengler's post-release behaviour did not include overt criminal activity. He was not arrested, did not violate parole, and avoided behaviours that would have triggered law enforcement attention. However, his internal mental state was getting worse. Spengler developed a deep hatred toward law enforcement and government authority. He viewed police and public officials as enemies and expressed these views in private writings. However, he did not share these sentiments publicly or make direct threats that would have justified stepping in. Spengler's being alone allowed his rage to fester without external detection. He had no close relationships, no social support network, and no one who might have recognized warning signs or intervened. His reclusiveness made him invisible to authorities and neighbours alike. In the years leading up to the Christmas Eve attack, Spengler began accumulating weapons and bullets. Because he was a convicted felon, he was legally prohibited from owning firearms. However, he got weapons through illegal channels, likely purchasing them from individuals who did not conduct background checks. Spengler also began writing. He kept detailed notes expressing his hatred of society, law enforcement, and specific individuals. These writings showed a man fixated on grievance and fantasizing about violence. However, the writings were private and not discovered until after the attack. The crimes committed by William Spengler on December 24, 2012, met the threshold for capital punishment under New York law. Planned crime of first responders, targeting of public safety personnel, and the use of arson as a weapon all made up capital-level offences. Spengler's planning was large. He spent months, possibly years, preparing for the attack. He stockpiled firearms, bullets, and accelerants. He wrote a manifesto outlining his hatred and describing his plan to do what I like doing best, ending people. The selection of Christmas Eve was planned. Spengler recognised that emergency response on Christmas Eve would be predictable. Firefighters would arrive quickly to extinguish the fire. Fewer personnel would be on duty due to holiday schedules, reducing the potential for right-of-way reinforcement. The Christmas Eve timing ensured that his attack would receive maximum media attention and symbolic impact. The fire itself was carefully planned. Spengler started his home and a nearby car to create a large, visible blaze that would guarantee a rapid response. He positioned himself in a hid location with a clear line of sight to the area where firefighters would park their vehicles. Spengler's use of a .223 caliber semi-automatic rifle showed preparation and intent. The weapon was capable of rapid, accurate fire at medium range. He had practiced and was familiar with its operation. The choice of weapon reflected his military-style approach to the ambush. There was no government pressure or external threat that triggered the attack. Spengler was not under investigation, and he had no pending legal issues. He faced no eviction, financial crisis, or right-away personal stressor. The attack was the ending of long-term planning driven by internal hatred, not external circumstances. Spengler's manifesto proved his intent. He wrote that he planned to burn down his neighbourhood and end as many first responders as possible. He described the attack as something he enjoyed and looked forward to ending. The manifesto was discovered after his death and provided chilling insight into his mindset. William Spengler started the attack at about 5:30 a.m. on December 24, 2012. He set fire to his home and a car, creating a large blaze visible from surrounding streets. The fire department received emergency calls and dispatched crews immediately. When firefighters arrived at Lake Road, they began setting up equipment to combat the blaze. Spengler opened fire from a hid position across the street. He fired multiple rounds in rapid succession, striking 4 firefighters before they could take cover. Tomasz Kachowka and Michael Chiaparini were ended instantly. 2 other firefighters were critically wounded. The survivors dragged wounded co-workers to safety while under continued fire. Spengler kept his position and continued shooting, preventing emergency personnel from approaching the scene. The standoff continued for hours. Tactical units used armoured vehicles to extract wounded firefighters and civilians trapped in the area. Spengler's fire spread to additional structures, finally destroying 7 homes. The standoff between law enforcement and William Spengler lasted about 5.5 hours. During this time, Spengler fired intermittently at police vehicles and anyone attempting to approach his position. He had positioned himself with a clear line of sight to Lake Road and the surrounding area, allowing him to observe police movements and prevent rescue operations. Tactical teams from multiple agencies responded to the scene. The Webster Police Department was joined by Monroe County Sheriff's deputies, New York State Police tactical units, and federal agents. The responding officers set up a perimeter about 2 blocks from Spengler's position, using armoured vehicles and natural cover to protect themselves from his fire. The fire that Spengler had set continued to burn and spread during the standoff. Wind conditions on Christmas Eve morning were unfavourable, causing the flames to jump to adjacent properties. 7 homes were finally destroyed, displacing dozens of residents. Firefighters could not approach to combat the blaze while Spengler continued shooting, allowing the fire to burn unchecked for hours. Residents in the right-of-way area were evacuated using armoured police vehicles. Officers moved door to door, alerting families and escorting them to safety. Some residents had been trapped in their homes since the shooting began at 5:30 a.m. Elderly residents and families with small children were prioritised for evacuation. The evacuation process was dangerous because Spengler continued firing at any movement he detected. The 2 wounded firefighters, who had been shot during the initial ambush, were extracted using an armoured police car around 8 a.m. They were transported to Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, where they underwent emergency surgery. Both survived their injuries, but required extended recovery periods. The extraction operation occurred under continued fire from Spengler's position. Negotiators attempted to establish communication with Spengler, but he did not respond to phone calls or loudspeaker announcements. His silence suggested that he had no intention of surrendering or engaging in dialogue. Tactical commanders determined that an assault on Spengler's position would be too dangerous, given his elevated shooting position and the fire hazard in the area. Around 11 a.m, the shooting ceased. Tactical teams waited about 30 minutes to ensure that Spengler was not simply pausing to reload or reposition. When no additional shots were fired, officers cautiously advanced toward his location. They discovered Spengler's body near the burned remains of his property. They took his own life. Wound to the head showed that he had ended the standoff by taking his own life. At about 11 a.m, the shooting stopped. Tactical teams cautiously approached Spengler's position. They discovered his body near the burning property. He had died from taking his own life. Evidence seized from the scene included the .223 caliber rifle, a .38 caliber revolver, bullets, and Spengler's handwritten manifesto. Spent shell casings littered the area where Spengler had positioned himself. Ballistic analysis later proved that the rounds that ended the firefighters came from his rifle. The investigation into the Christmas Eve firefighter ambush proved that William Spengler acted alone. Forensic evidence, witness statements, and Spengler's manifesto set up a clear timeline and motive. Ballistic analysis matched the .223 caliber rifle found at the scene to the bullets that ended Tomasz Kachowka and Michael Chiapparini. Firing pin marks and rifling patterns were consistent. The rifle had been obtained illegally, as Spengler was prohibited from owning firearms due to his felony guilty decision. The manifesto found near Spengler's body proved his motive. He wrote that he intended to burn down his neighbourhood and end first responders. He expressed satisfaction at the thought of causing death and described ending as something he enjoyed. The manifesto left no doubt about his intent or the planned nature of the attack. Fire investigators proved that the blaze had been intentionally set using accelerants. Multiple ignition points were identified, indicating that Spengler had carefully prepared the fire to ensure it would burn intensely and attract right-away emergency response. Witness statements came from surviving firefighters and neighbours who observed the attack. Survivors described hearing gunfire immediately upon arriving at the scene. They recounted the chaos of trying to drag wounded co-workers to safety while under continued fire. Spengler never confessed because he died before authorities could question him. However, his manifesto served as a written confession. It detailed his plan, proved his intent, and showed his enjoyment of violence. The document was chilling in its clarity and lack of remorse. Investigators also examined Spengler's background and discovered his 1981 guilty decision for attacking his grandmother. This history raised questions about how a convicted attacker could obtain firearms and plan such an attack without detection. There was no trial in the Christmas Eve firefighter ambush because William Spengler took his own life. His death removed the possibility of a criminal legal case. However, authorities issued public statements confirming that he would have faced multiple capital charges had he survived. The charges would have included 2 counts of first-degree crime for the firefighters he ended, multiple counts of attempted crime for the wounded responders, arson, illegal weapons possession, and terrorism-related offences. New York law would have permitted the most severe sentences available. The legal classification of the case was crime arson taking his own life. Prosecutors reviewed all evidence and concluded that Spengler had committed planned crime. The ambush showed extreme planning and the planned targeting of public safety personnel. William Spengler received no sentence because he died before arrest. However, the Christmas Eve firefighter ambush prompted nationwide review of firefighter response protocols and security measures. Government authorities emphasized the need for law enforcement escorts when responding to suspicious fires. Protocols were updated to include threat assessments before firefighters entered potentially dangerous scenes. These changes were directly influenced by Spengler's attack. Surviving family members and co-workers mourned the loss of Tomasz Koczowka and Michael Chiapparini. Memorial services were held, and both firefighters were honoured posthumously for their service. The community of Webster held vigils and set up scholarships in their names. The case was cited nationally as an example of how convicted violent offenders can re-emerge to commit terrible crimes. Spengler's 1981 crime guilty decision should have flagged him as a high-risk individual, but he faced no monitoring or restrictions at the time of the attack. Policy discussions focused on how to improve tracking of individuals with violent histories. However, legal limitations on watching of individuals who have completed their sentences complicated efforts to implement more aggressive monitoring. William Spengler is deceased. His body was cremated and no public memorial services were held. The property where the attack occurred was destroyed by fire, and the land was eventually cleared. The Christmas Eve firefighter ambush remains one of the deadliest attacks on first responders in US history. The case is referenced in training programs for firefighters and law enforcement personnel. It serves as a reminder that emergency calls can be used as a weapon and that responders must remain vigilant, even during routine operations. Public memory of the case persists in Webster, New York, where the attack devastated the community. Annual memorials honor the fallen firefighters, and the tragedy remains a defining event in the town's history. What this case reveals extends beyond Spengler's individual problem. It demonstrates that convicted violent offenders can plan and end complex attacks, even after serving their sentences. Spengler's ability to obtain illegal firearms, stockpile bullets, and prepare an ambush without detection illustrated gaps in post-release monitoring. The Christmas Eve timing was exploited for tactical advantages. The holiday ensured predictable emergency response patterns and reduced personnel availability. Spengler used as a weapon the holiday, transforming Christmas Eve from a time of celebration into a scene of targeted violence. Before we move on to the final case, make sure you're subscribed if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While William Spengler turned Christmas Eve emergency response into an ending field, the final case shows how another attacker used a Santa costume on Christmas morning to gain access to his estranged family for one last act of destruction. Case 7. Aziz Yazdan Pana. On Christmas morning 2011, Aziz Yazdan Pana entered his estranged wife's apartment in Grapevine, Texas, dressed as Santa Claus. The family was actively opening Christmas presents when he arrived. 7 people were present: his estranged wife, 2 of his children, and 4 other relatives. Within minutes, all 6 family members were dead, and Yazdan Pana had taken his own life. The crimes occurred on Christmas morning, while the victims were celebrating the holiday. The Santa costume allowed Yazdan Pana to approach without triggering an alarm. Family members opened the door expecting a festive visitor, and instead met a man carrying a handgun. Yazdan Pana shot each victim multiple times at close range. The attack was swift and careful. He moved through the apartment, firing repeatedly to ensure lethality. Some victims were shot while opening gifts, others were struck while attempting to flee. The youngest victims were teenagers. After ending 6 people, Yazdan Pana turned the gun on himself. He took his own life in the apartment. His body was found alongside those of his victims when police arrived later that morning. The Grapevine Christmas Day mass crime became one of the deadliest Christmas morning familicides in the US. It was immediately compared to the Bruce Pardo case due to the Santa costume and Christmas timing. The case showed how trust associated with holiday symbols could be exploited for violence. The apartment complex where the crimes occurred was a normal suburban home community. Neighbors heard what sounded like fireworks or firecrackers, but did not immediately recognize the sounds as gunfire. The Christmas morning timing meant that many residents were inside their own homes celebrating, reducing the likelihood of early detection. Aziz. Originally from Iran, Yazdan Pana and later immigrated to the United States. He settled in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, where he worked and raised a family. His background included marriage, children, and a life that appeared outwardly stable. However, Yazdan Pana's marriage got worse over time. His wife sought separation and eventually moved out of the family home. Custody disputes arose, and the relationship became increasingly hostile. Court records later showed that domestic incidents had been reported, though details were limited. Yazdan Pana became fixated on maintaining control over his family. As his wife set up independence, he grew more desperate and unstable. Friends and relatives later reported that he had expressed anger about the separation and made statements suggesting he could not accept the loss of his family. Yazdan Pana had no large criminal record. Earlier domestic incidents had been reported to authorities, but no charges resulted in convictions that would have prevented him from owning firearms or accessing his family. From a legal standpoint, there were limited grounds for stepping in. In the months leading up to Christmas 2011, Yazdan Pana's behaviour suggested increasing desperation. He continued attempting to reconcile with his wife despite her refusal. He made repeated contact attempts that bordered on harassment, but did not cross clear legal thresholds for protection orders or criminal charges. The separation created the conditions for escalation. Yazdan Pana interpreted the loss of his family as a personal and cultural betrayal. His inability to accept the end of the relationship drove him toward violence. The Christmas gathering provided an opportunity to access all of his intended victims in one location. The crimes committed by Aziz Yazdan Pana on December 25, 2011, met the threshold for capital punishment under Texas law. Multiple planned crimes, crime of minors, and the targeting of an entire family made up capital-level offences. Yazdan Pana's planning behaviours included acquiring a handgun, obtaining a Santa Claus costume, and identifying the location where his estranged family would be gathered. He knew that Christmas morning would bring everyone together, creating the perfect opportunity for his attack. The Santa costume served the same purpose it had in the Bruce Pardo case. It removed suspicion. Yazdan Pana could approach the apartment dressed as Santa without alarming his victims. The costume suggested festivity and celebration, not danger. When the door opened, victims likely smiled or welcomed him before realizing the threat. The crimes themselves were at close range. Yazdan Pana fired multiple rounds into each victim to ensure death. He did not hesitate or show mercy. The attack showed cold calculation and total commitment to the plan. Christmas Day was deliberately chosen. The holiday ensured that the family would be gathered and that outside activity would be minimal. Neighbours celebrating Christmas in their own homes were less likely to notice or intervene. The timing provided Yazdan Pana with the access and being alone he needed. There was no government pressure or external threat that triggered the attack. Yazdan Pana faced custody disputes and separation, but these were civil matters, not criminal threats. He was not under investigation or facing a legal case. The decision to end his family was driven by his inability to accept the end of his marriage and his fixation on control. There was no arrest or capture in the Grapevine Christmas Day mass crime, because Aziz Yazdan Pana took his own life at the scene. Police arrived at the apartment after neighbours reported hearing unusual sounds. Officers entered and discovered 7 bodies, 6 victims, and Yazdan Pana. Evidence seized from the scene included the handgun used in the crimes, spent shell casings, the Santa Claus costume, and personal items belonging to the victims. Ballistic analysis later proved that all deadly shots came from the same weapon. The right-away aftermath shocked the Grapevine community and the nation. News of the Christmas Day crimes spread rapidly. Media outlets covered the case extensively, drawing comparisons to other Christmas family annihilations. The Santa costume and holiday timing created a narrative that resonated with audiences horrified by the betrayal of Christmas symbolism. The investigation proved that Aziz Yazdan Pana acted alone. Forensic evidence, witness statements from neighbours, and the crime scene itself set up a clear sequence of events. Ballistic analysis proved that the handgun found at the scene matched the bullets recovered from the victims. The weapon had been bought legally, and Yazdan Pana had no criminal record that would have prevented ownership. Autopsies showed that all victims died from multiple gunshot wounds. The close-range nature of the wounds showed at close-range crimes. Victims had no opportunity to defend themselves or escape. The attack was over within minutes. Witness statements came from neighbours who heard the gunfire and from relatives who provided context about the family dynamics. These accounts proved that Yazdan Pana had been struggling with the separation and had expressed desperation about losing his family. Yazdan Pana left no written confession or manifesto. His motive was inferred from the circumstances: a separated husband fixated on control, a Christmas gathering that provided access to all victims, and a costume that removed suspicion. The investigation into the Grapevine Christmas Day crimes showed additional context about Yazdan Pana's getting worse in the months before the attack. Friends and relatives described him as increasingly desperate and unstable. He had made statements suggesting that he could not accept the end of his marriage and that he viewed his wife's independence as a betrayal. Court records showed that Yazdan Pana and his wife had been separated for several months before Christmas 2011. She had moved into the Grapevine apartment with their children to establish distance from him. Custody arrangements allowed him limited visitation rights, which he had exercised inconsistently. His behaviour during visits had become erratic, prompting concerns from family members. The handgun used in the crimes was a semi-automatic pistol bought legally several years earlier. Yazdan Pana had no felony convictions that would have prevented firearm ownership. The weapon was registered in his name and had been kept properly. Ballistic analysis proved that all deadly shots came from this single weapon. The Santa Claus costume was bought from a costume shop in the Dallas-Fort Worth area about 1 week before Christmas. Store employees did not recall the specific transaction, as many customers bought Santa costumes during the holiday season. The costume was found at the scene, partially soaked in blood. It had been a full suit, including the red jacket, pants, hat, and white beard. Forensic examination of the apartment showed that the attack had been swift and overwhelming. Victims had been shot multiple times at close range, ensuring deadly injuries. Spent shell casings were scattered throughout the living room and adjacent areas, indicating that Yazdan Pana had moved through the apartment firing continuously. The youngest victims had been teenagers, shot while attempting to flee toward the back of the apartment. Neighbours reported hearing what they described as rapid popping sounds around 11:30 a.m. on Christmas morning. Several residents initially thought the sounds were fireworks or firecrackers, which were sometimes used in the area during holidays. One neighbour recalled looking out a window and seeing people running, but the distance prevented clear observation. Another neighbour called 911 about 15 minutes after the shooting began, reporting suspicious sounds and possible gunfire. Police arrived at the apartment complex around noon on December 25th. Officers entered the apartment and discovered 7 bodies. The scene was immediately secured as a crime investigation. Crime scene technicians worked throughout Christmas Day and into December 26th to document evidence and process the site. The investigation proved that Yazdan Pana had acted alone and that no other individuals were involved in the planning or death penalty of the crimes. Aziz Yazdan Pana received no sentence due to his death. However, the Grapevine Christmas Day mass crime raised alarms about holiday domestic violence and the exploitation of festive symbols for access. Public reaction focused on the parallels to the Bruce Pardo case. Both men used Santa costumes to gain entry to family gatherings. Both committed mass crimes on Christmas. Both took his own lives after the attacks. The similarities suggested a pattern that could inform future threat assessments. Surviving relatives and the broader community mourned the victims. Memorial services were held, and the tragedy left lasting trauma on those who knew the family. Aziz Yazdan Pana is deceased. The apartment where the crimes occurred was later vacated and eventually occupied by new residents. No physical memorial exists at the site, though the community of Grapevine holds private commemorations. The case remains a stark example of how Christmas trust can override self-protection. The Santa costume neutralized caution, allowing Yazdan Pana to approach an attack without resistance. The holiday timing ensured that all victims were gathered in one location, maximizing the lethality of the attack. What this case reveals extends beyond individual problems. It demonstrates that domestic violence can escalate to terrible levels when separation removes control. Yazdan Pana's inability to accept the end of his marriage drove him to exterminate his family rather than give up power. The 7 cases examined reveal a disturbing pattern. Christmas is not a deterrent to violence, but a tactical opportunity deliberately exploited by offenders. From Bruce Pardo's fire device attack to Aziz Yazdanpanar's Santa-disguised death penalty, these attackers recognize that holidays create concentrated victims, reduced vigilance, and delayed discovery. Family gatherings become ending grounds. Festive symbols eliminate suspicion. Holiday being alone prevents me from stepping in. These offenders use Christmas itself as a weapon. Christmas itself, transforming celebration into catastrophe and permanently altering how survivors experience the holiday. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most evil Christmas attackers who shocked the entire nation, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.